Hey there, good afternoon. I think we're about at 2 o'clock, and so we want to welcome you to our webinar today. The class today is going to be on weeds, identification and control. And we've got Sheridan Hansen, who is the Davis County USU Extension agent that's going to be presenting this for us today. And we're really excited to have her share her knowledge with us. So before we get started though, just a few things, and I know there will be a few others joining us, and I'll try to maybe remind or whatever along the way. So because this is a webinar format, it would get too chaotic to have everybody chiming in through their audio controls. So everyone is muted. There will be no video from any participants. We would encourage you to use the Q&A button on the little control bar that you have on this webinar. Use that Q&A button to type in your questions. And as Sheridan is presenting, I will try to address those questions as we go. Anything that I don't feel comfortable addressing, I'll either jump in and interrupt Sheridan at a good break point, and we'll address those questions, or we'll hold those questions to the end and address all those questions. So please just type your questions in there. I think you have an option to raise your hand or something like that. We're not really going to respond to the raise hand issues. Just we'll probably just ignore your hand if you raise it. But please type in your questions in the Q&A button, and we'll get to those questions and make sure you hopefully leave this webinar with a better understanding of weeds, how to identify them, and how to control and manage those weeds. Also, just a little reminder, we do still have some upcoming classes. We'll continue to do these online format at least for the month of June, and then we'll, month to month, we're kind of just assessing where we are. Next week, we didn't really have a specific topic in mind, and so we're just kind of having a little bit of a Q&A open forum. And so if you have questions about various things in the landscape, we want you to jump on. We just want to have a dialogue and answer questions and concerns you have with all kinds of landscape issues. So please kind of tune into that if you're interested, and watch our website for additional things. For those that are maybe brand new or not recently joined to our webinars and any of the previous ones, this webinar will be recorded, and it will be posted onto our website, a link that you can go back and watch the entire webinar in its entirety. If you want just the slides, Sheridan has provided those slides, and they will be on our website. So you can just review each slide and go through that at the pace you like. That will also be on our website as a PDF file. So with that, Sheridan, thanks for joining us. I'll turn the time over to you. I'm going to mute myself and get out of the picture, and we'll just turn it right over to you. I'll stop sharing my screen, and we'll just get right into it.
Thank you, Dave. I'm really excited to be here. So like Dave said, I am an assistant professor of horticulture at USU Extension. I'm located at the USU Botanical Center in Kaysville. And if you haven't visited us, I highly encourage you to do so. We are open 24/7 pretty much, from dawn to dusk is what we say, but we do have people come at other times. So it is kind of open 24/7, but we have some great gardens that you guys can walk through and some really nice demonstrations. We have 100 acres, ponds, there is a walking trail, we have a 7-acre arboretum, and we have several edible areas, and also a new park strip garden that we're just putting in to show you how to conserve water in your park strip. So that's just going in. So some exciting things are happening. So, but today I'm going to talk to you about weeds, and weeds are kind of the, it kind of levels the field with all of us. We all have problems with weeds, whether you want to or not, whether you're a horticulturist or you're just, learning about horticulture, weeds are going to be something that you're going to have to battle. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to dive right into this.
So Sheridan, while you're getting that pulled up, are you okay with me jumping in occasionally if there's a question that's right pertinent to the slide you're on?
Yes, that's great.
We'll do that, and then I'll just repeat the question that's typed in, and we'll get those addressed.
Oops, this is not, yeah, that's just fine.
Okay.
Oh, it closed out my technical difficulties. One moment. It closed out my PowerPoint. There we go. All right. Now we're going to share the screen. I don't know why it did that. Okay, can you see my screen? All right, so here we go. So one of the biggest questions that I get is, what is a weed? I mean, we see all these beautiful flowers, and you can see, like, we've got gorgeous flowers up here, things that you maybe wouldn't consider a weed. And a lot of the times I'll get emails. We run a diagnostic clinic at the USU Botanical Center as well. And I will get emails occasionally that say, you know, I didn't plant this. Is it a weed? Well, if you didn't plant it and it just sporadically came up, my hunch would be, yes, it's a weed. But you can see weeds can be absolutely beautiful. We have all different kinds of things here that it's like sneezeweed up here at the top. We've got buttercup. We've got bachelor's buttons, which a lot of people plant intentionally. Same with the sneezeweed. We have tickseed coreopsis. Dandelions is probably the most common thing that everybody deals with. And this is foxtail, which, I mean, if you're looking at it in a picture, it might be a really pretty grass, but out in the landscape, it's very not desirable. So what is a weed? I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the definitions of what is a weed. There are a lot of definitions. So a lot of the times we'll say it's a plant out of place. So I didn't plant it, it came up where it wasn't wanted, or I have, so this happened in my yard, I have coneflowers all over my yard and they like to reseed, and so they're coming up in places where I shouldn't have coneflowers. So that coneflower is now considered a weed for me in those areas because it is out of place. Another definition is a plant growing where it's not desired. So kind of same idea, but you know, it just slightly different wording. An undesirable plant. These are plants that we don't want in our landscape, or we don't want it where it is. So something that you don't want. So when somebody sends me that picture, it just happened yesterday. Someone sent me a picture and said, what is this? It's in my yard. I didn't plant it. I've lived here forever. I don't know what it is. And I said, well, do you want it? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, then it's a weed. So take it out. A weed can also be a plant that interferes. So this is a plant that interferes with growth of any other plant. So a lot of the time, we're going to talk a little bit about noxious weeds and also invasive weeds. They interfere with the natural landscape, the natural flora and fauna that we've got going on, those natural grasses, that type of thing. They compete for resources and they'll interfere with some of our other plants that are desirable that we want to grow. I love this one. This one's by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course he put it in a poetic form. He said, a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. So maybe it's a plant that we just haven't learned to appreciate yet. We just don't quite, we don't have a love for it yet, and that's okay. And this one's great. A plant that has mastered every survival skill except for how to grow in rows. So, you know, they're kind of, weeds are kind of unruly. They come up where they want. They do whatever they want. They kind of have their own agenda in the garden. And Dave and I were talking before this class started, and, you know, he said, you know, they come up without water. They come up, you know, without all the resources that you would think a plant would need, without fertilizer, without all these things. And it just comes up, and it, you know, whether you want it to or not, it's going to be there. So they have incredible survival skills. They can survive in the poorest soils and in the poorest conditions with zero water. Also, a weed can be defined, this is one of my favorite, a plant that someone will spend time and money to kill. I mean, how much money and time do we spend killing weeds? It's a huge amount of my time. At the Botanical Center, we spend a lot of time working on our weed problem, and we have a lot of weeds. We're just still trying to get them all under control because this used to be a farm and no one took care of it for a long time, so we have all these weeds. So we spend an incredible amount of money and resources and time on these, and you do too in your landscape. If it is lush, green, and thriving in the garden, it's a weed. And that kind of goes back to what Dave said. You know, they'll thrive without any resources available to them. They have mastered that survival skill. Okay, here's the for real definition. When we talk about weeds kind of from a university standpoint, we define a weed as this: any plant that interferes with the management objectives for a given area of land or body of water at a given point in time. So it is a plant that is going to interfere with our objectives. What is your goal? What is your purpose with that landscape? Do you want a beautiful stand of turf? Are you looking to create a cottage garden? What are you looking to create? And then anything that doesn't fit into that plan becomes a weed. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some of our common garden and landscape weeds. These are things that you're going to see in your yard, in your landscape, things that you're going to have to combat. on a day-to-day basis. And the first one is dandelion. This one is an absolutely terrible weed because it has this ability to spread. It's a fantastic weed if you're a bee. These are highly valuable to our bee populations, our native bee populations, and our honeybees. This is one of the first flowers that blooms early in the spring. And so it is a great resource for them for pollen, which is a source of protein, and also for some nectar. And if you don't know about bees in Utah, Utah is a hot spot for bee diversity. So we have over 900 different species of native bees here. And so that's more than what you see in the rest of the country. We have more than half of the population, the diversity of the bees that are named throughout North America. So we have a huge variety of bees here. So dandelions are an important food source for them. The dandelion is a perennial. So when we talk about weeds, it becomes really important to understand what that plant's growth cycle is. Is it an annual? So an annual is going to come up from seed every single year. It's going to come up from seed and it's going to set seed, and the original mother plant that created the seed is going to die and it's not going to be there next year. As opposed to something that is a biennial. So a biennial takes 2 years to complete that same life cycle. So the first year you'll see this flush of green growth and these leaves on the bottom, and then the second year you'll see a stalk that will form, and then that will flower and it will produce seed. Now a perennial like dandelion is a little bit different. These form a taproot. Most of our perennials will form a taproot, and that taproot is long and it goes deep down into the soil. And when these plants are taprooted, they can be very difficult to control, and it's going to come back in our landscape year after year after year. If we don't manage it, it's going to become, start from this little tiny dandelion to this monster plant that puts out so many seeds into our landscape that make it very difficult to control. So a lot of people will eat dandelions, so it does have some virtues there. The bees, the edibles, people will eat the leaves. They're actually really high in things like vitamin C. I myself have not eaten the dandelions, but if you want to do that, that's kind of your thing, and that's a great thing. We are all familiar with the seed head, this little puff ball that shows up on the plant, and if you have kids, you're probably responsible for a lot of the dandelion seed dispersal that goes on. I know my kids have been a part of that, so we've contributed to the problem. But those seed heads, they have this really interesting parachute type seed on top of that head. And the whole point is for that seed to be able to move throughout the landscape, move across a great distance through the wind, and plant itself in a new location. So you can see how adaptable just the dandelion is. It has that taproot, it lives year after year, it's created a way for it to spread those seeds a great distance, and it thrives in our environment. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what is a broadleaf weed and what is a grass type weed. So broadleaf weeds are things like dandelions. See these leaves here? They form kind of a round toothed leaf, and that leaf, because it is round, has a different metabolism than our grass does. So if we had dandelions coming up in our grass, we can use what's called a broadleaf weed killer. And the active ingredient in a lot of our broadleaf weed killers is called 2,4-D. And that you can spray onto your lawn, and it will kill the broadleaf weeds, but it will not kill your lawn. So because there's two different metabolisms working there. Grass works one way and broadleaf weeds work another way. You can also remove these by hand. If you've seen those little dandelion diggers that you push, they kind of have a fork on the tip of the tool, and you push that down around the taproot and it helps to pop that dandelion up out of the ground. So that is dandelion. White clover is another weed that you may run across. And this pops up in your lawns. It pops up kind of early spring. You can see it has this kind of pink, sometimes white flower head on the top. You can see the white flower there. This is kind of what it looks like. It kind of sprawls out in your lawn, and these are really common in lawns. So it does this kind of sprawling out thing. Again, another really good early food source for bees. So this is kind of where we get a little conflicted. Do I feed the bees? Do I take care of my yard? What do I do? And this comes down to your objective. What is your objective? And a lot of us want a really nice yard. So we'll have an area where maybe we don't, you know, we don't worry about so many of the weeds, but the rest of the yard, you know, we keep and we maintain and we keep it kind of pristine. So this is a creeping perennial. And so you can see how that plant has kind of opened up down here in this bottom left picture. It's kind of opened up and it's sprawled out. And that's kind of how it helps itself creep. So this flower head will also put out seeds, and then it will creep along the stems and create new little batches of this clover. It can be kind of tough to get rid of. So again, this is a broadleaf weed, so we're going to go back to that broadleaf weed killer. If you're not into using chemicals, then your options are hand pulling, and you want to hand pull this before seeds are dispersed, because once those seeds are dispersed out into the environment, we're going to have a problem. You know, because now that we've got seeds that are going to come up next year. So we want to make sure we get to these before seed dispersal. And that goes for almost any of these plants that we're talking about. Getting to that flower before the seeds are dispersed is very, very important. Black medic is one that is brought into our office almost continually. This one shows up in lawns and it can be very, very difficult to get rid of. So it kind of has that clover-like leaf, and you can see that here. It looks a lot like clover, but we've got this little yellow flower on the top of it, and it puts out a great number of small seeds. It's an annual, so this is different than the two perennials we've talked about. So this is an annual. It's going to reseed every year. So with our annual weeds, one important thing that kind of stands out, that should stand out to you, is I need to keep these seeds from germinating. So if I had a plant and it went to seed, how do I keep those seeds from germinating next year? And the answer is pre-emergence. So we can put down a pre-emergent early in the spring. We usually say that if you're going to put down a pre-emergent on your lawn, you'll want to put down a crabgrass control, and it usually has some other things in it that will control things like black medic. Get this down when the forsythia blooms. If you're not familiar with what forsythia is, it's that bush that blooms bright yellow early in the spring. It's usually about mid-March, sometimes end of March. It depends on our spring and how warm we are. But black medic is one of those that can be treated with that pre-emergent herbicide, that chemical layer that we put down, and that keeps that chemical layer, it forms a barrier. And how it works is that barrier is there as the seeds start to germinate with water and light early in the spring. It hits that barrier, and that stops that seed from continuing the germination process. So the seeds may still be there, they may still germinate, but they're not going to continue to grow. Again, this one, if you're not going to use chemicals, it comes down to a lot of elbow grease, and people don't like it when I say that, but that's just how it is. I was an organic small-scale farmer for a number of years, and being organic is a tough job. You're going to put in a lot more work, you know, a lot more of that labor-intensive type work. So knowing that if you're not going to use chemicals, your options are to pull it. You also want to, if this is in your lawn, you need to look at the health of your lawn. So your lawn should be nice and lush and thick. And how we achieve that is we do proper mowing. So we want to keep our grass a little bit higher. So right now our grass should be between 2.5 and 3 inches tall. We want to make sure that we fertilize properly in the spring and in the fall. We want to make sure we're aerating so that we have good water drainage. We have air down by the roots, and we incorporate some of that organic matter back into those areas to kind of reduce compaction. And then watering properly, and Dave can totally school you on this, I'm sure, but you should not be watering more than 3 times a week, and you want to be watering infrequently, and you want to be watering deeply to drive the roots of the grass down deeper into the soil so that it can access water. It makes a tougher lawn so that it can withstand heat and you know, some of the dry conditions that we have with not so much water. So improving your lawn stand will really help you with controlling some of these weeds, especially if you're going to be organic. You can also do a post-emergent herbicide in the fall. So 2,4-D, again, is that broadleaf weed killer. I should mention that 2,4-D should not be used when it is hot. So reading the labels is really, really important. So I was just the victim of a massacre with 2,4-D in my yard. I have a vacant lot next to my house that is owned by a water company that is not Weaver Basin. And I asked them to control the weeds in the lot. So they had a company come out and they sprayed. And they sprayed when it was windy and they sprayed when it was too warm. And my entire yard has been hit with 2,4-D. Completely wiped out a whole bunch of my trees. I lost trees. My mom lives across the street from me. I got really far in life. I live across the street from my mom. And her yard is an established yard, a little more established than my yard is. And she has huge 25-year-old trees that got wiped out. And you know, we've had to go through all of this legality now, trying to fix this problem and get some compensation so that they can replace our trees and our shrubs, that type of thing. But the thing is, the bottom line is, you don't want to spray when it's above 85 degrees. Do not spray when it is windy. So if we're going to be controlling with a broadleaf weed killer some of these types of weeds, we're going to control in the spring when it's nice and cool, and in the fall when it's nice and cool. And in the summertime, you're on to hand pulling. That's the tool that is available to you when it's hot outside. Let's move on. Crabgrass. This one is like the bane of everyone's existence. Crabgrass is a really tough one to deal with sometimes. So it likes to come up, it germinates early in the spring. It's an annual, and it will create these little seed heads. You can see the seed heads here. They look like fingers. And those fingery seed heads will put down that seed late in the summer, and that seed will overwinter in your turf, and then in the spring it germinates and comes up out of the ground. So this one is very well controlled with some of those pre-emergent herbicides. So if you wanted to put down, there's a preen for grass that works really well. All of those really nice chemical barriers will work well on crabgrass. So you want to get that down again before forsythia blooms, so mid-March. And then what happens with this, and this is where it tends to be a problem for a lot of people, is you mow your lawn and you're going to edge your lawn. And when you edge that lawn, you break that chemical barrier that you've created with that pre-emergent herbicide. And those seeds that are on that edge now can germinate and come up. So we'll see crabgrass go all along the edges of the lawn where people are edging against the sidewalk or against the curb, those types of areas. So you may have to do a second application of pre-emergent herbicides. So we say mid-March, and then you can do another one in May, and that will help. But you still may get some along the edges of that lawn. It can be a little bit tougher to deal with. So the application of pre-emergent is important. The seedlings germinate when our temperatures are around 55 degrees. So you want to have that pre-emergent down before our temperatures are consistently 55 degrees. You can hand pull it. And if you're going to do that, you want to get to it before it puts out these seed heads. These seed heads, once they're out, they're going to put down an awful lot of seed, and it can be really difficult to deal with. Again, maintaining your turf vigor, all those steps that I gave you for making sure that you have a really nice, healthy lawn will help to eliminate crabgrass, because your turf is going to outcompete that crabgrass. It's going to make it so that it can't grow, it can't germinate. We've got a nice, shady, dense stand of grass, so the sun won't even get down to those seeds and it won't germinate. Purslane is the worst. If I had to pick a weed that I hate, this would be in my top 3. So if you haven't experienced purslane, it's germinating in many gardens right now. This is the time when we start to see it. It likes heat. It's actually a succulent type plant. So it has these nice little fat succulent type leaves. And when I was an organic farmer, this was what we had in our area, in our soil. And it actually came in through the secondary water a bit. And we had filters, but the seeds are really, really small on this. So it can very easily go through filters. But you can see how small the seeds are right here. A lot of people eat this. My horse eats it. I don't. I'm just not going to eat it. That sounds just terrible to me, but you can see here, people will put it in smoothies. They say it's really high in vitamins and nutrition. I'm going to stick to things that are not weeds in my yard. So this one is often called resurrection weed, because when you pull it, if you leave it on the soil surface, it will find a way to put roots back down and start to grow again. So when you weed this, you have to actually take it up, put it in a bucket, put it in your garbage can, get it out of your landscape, get it away from everything, because it will reroot. It is a summer annual, so this is an annual. So again, we're dealing with something that can be stopped with a pre-emergent. So these plants are not going to be here next year. We're just going to grow from seed every single year. And the seeds, so I had this question. We have a Facebook group that all of us different horticulturists help to run. And it's called Utah's Gardening Experts. If you're interested in it, you should join it. We answer a ton of questions. We have about 6,500 people that are part of the group right now, and we spend a lot of time answering questions. So I had someone ask about purslane, and they said, what if I just don't do anything with it? What if I just leave it there, and then I take care of it this fall? And the little devil inside of me just kind of laughed, because I mean, it's just, you're just asking for trouble. And I carefully typed a very nice response that said, if you leave this and let it go to seed, the seeds are viable in the soil for 40 years. So they can stay in the soil, they create a really nice seed bank, and then they're just going to keep coming up. Even though you've taken care of the problem, even though you're weeding, even though you're on top of it, they're going to continue to come up because they are viable for so long. So if you leave this plant to go to seed, you're creating a problem, not just for yourself or your children, but maybe your grandchildren. So don't let this one go to seed if you can help it. So this makes a great horse feed. Like I said, my horse absolutely loves it. So if you have animals, rabbits, those types of things, chickens love it, you can definitely feed it to those animals. Pre-emergent herbicides are not as effective on this one, and that is because it has this, or post-emergent herbicides. I said pre, it's post-emergent. So if I was to go out and spray this with 2,4-D or with Roundup or glyphosate, it would not be as effective on that. And the reason why is because the leaves on this plant are thick and they have a really thick waxy coating on the outside of it. So this one just doesn't respond well to herbicides like how you would think it would. You can help this one if it's in your landscape areas. You can put down something like preen, a post or a pre-emergent herbicide, something to keep those seeds from germinating. That will really help you. This is one that gets really confused with purslane quite a bit, and this one's called spurge. And I hear it kind of the words kind of interchanged, the names kind of interchanged a little bit. But this one's spurge. Now you can see it kind of has the same leaf shape, kind of that oval leaf shape, but it's not thick like how purslane is. So if you look at the leaves, it actually gives you a little identifier on it. So it's not thick, and then it has this little purple spot in the middle of the leaf. Also, if I was to break the stem of this, I would get this white milky sap that comes out of it. So this one creates a milky sap. This one, prostrate spurge, I mean, it kind of tells you a little bit about it. It is so low and so close to the ground. And this one will come up in turf, and it can be very, very difficult to weed out. So it's an annual again. So again, we're looking at pre-emergent herbicides. Putting down that pre-emergent control is going to be really important with this one. You can hand pull this one in the heat of the summer when we can't do any kind of broadleaf weed killer. You could hand pull this one, but in the spring and in the fall, you could definitely use a broadleaf weed killer to help with control on this in your turf. Again, the seeds on this one live for quite some time, so you don't want to let this one go to seed. And you can see how tiny the flowers are. These are the flowers just right there in that middle picture, that little yellow area. So very small flowers, very, very small seeds. And this one can come in through secondary water also. So you may be on top of this and you go and you turn on your water, and even with filters, this one will come right through. So. All right, redroot pigweed. This one is in the amaranth family. And one thing that you should know about anything in the amaranth family, so they'll have this stalk, and then they'll have these huge seed heads up on the top. They'll also have from the axillary nodes, new growth come out of here, and it will produce another seed head. Anything in the amaranth family, think about like quinoa. That's in the same family. It's these little tiny round seeds, and it produces thousands and thousands of seeds. One plant can produce over 1,000 seeds. So if you let this go to seed, and you can see You can see all the little seed heads here. If you let this go to seed, you're going to have a problem for a very long time. The seeds on this one are viable for about 10 years. So if you let these go to seed, you're going to be fighting for about 10 years. And it's a summer annual, so it will come up. I started seeing questions about it a couple of weeks ago on that Facebook group. And it comes up like a carpet, it comes up everywhere, and super thick, dense stands that you'll see, all of these little seedlings, and they'll have a little tiny red stem. And that goes down to the root, and that root is red, and you can see it here in this photo. So if you start to pull them and you see that little red part on the top of the root, that is redroot pigweed. That's one of the ways that we ID it. You can, again, use broadleaf weed killers on this one. Soil solarization works really well on this. So if you're organic and this is coming up in a garden area and you're trying to get rid of it, what you can do with solarization is you take a large sheet of clear plastic and you place that over the area where you want to have that garden, and you're going to stake it down. You want the soil to be a little moist because solarization works best when we have a little bit of moisture. And you're going to leave that out in the garden through summer for 3 to 6 weeks. And what that does is it creates an environment that is extremely hot, and it basically cooks the seeds. And when it cooks those seeds, they become not viable anymore. So that's one of the ways that we deal with redroot pigweed. And it's notorious for coming up in garden areas, anywhere soil has been disturbed. This one doesn't necessarily come up in turf so much, but anywhere where soil has been disturbed, you'll see this one start to come up. Mulches will also help with this one. So if you want to put down a nice mulch, you can even use grass clippings. One of the things to remember with grass clippings, though, is if you've had a company come out and treat and spray a broadleaf weed killer, taking those grass clippings and putting them out into the garden bed, you want to make sure that they have not been sprayed with 2,4-D in the last 3 weeks, because that 2,4-D can remain active and it will actually kill some of the plants in your garden.
Sheridan, is this one also edible?
Some people will eat it. Yeah, you can kind of probably see the look on my face. Some people will eat it. I don't eat this one. If I was gonna eat one, it would probably be the Purslane or the Dandelions over this one. People have said that you can eat the seeds on it because it is in the amaranth family, but I mean, I would just go get quinoa and call it good. So, okay. Other questions, Dave? Are we good?
So far, we're good. We've caught up with everything.
Okay, good. All right, next one is Lambsquarters. This one kind of has a similar type seed head. I mean, you can see there's all these little flowers. It's in a different family. This is in what we call the Chenopodiaceae family, or the goosefoot family. So if you look at the leaves, they kind of are the shape of a goose's foot. Kind of turned backwards. So these ones are notorious also for putting out a huge amount of seed. The seeds can live in the soil again for 20+ years. So we're looking at, you know, a problem for you and your kids here. And it is an annual, so it will put out seeds every single year and will come up from those seeds every year. This one gets really tall. So if you have this one in your yard and you were to allow it to reach its full height, it can get up to 6 feet high. So it's a really large weed. And you want to pull it before it gets that large, because once it gets to a height of about 6 feet, it's going to be difficult to get it out of the ground. So hand pulling this one before the seeds set, it really does come out of the ground easily when it's young. You can cultivate, use a rake. I use a hula hoe or a scuffle hoe, and that takes care of this one and the redroot pigweed really quickly. It just annihilates it. And these ones, if you leave them on the ground, it's not like purslane. It's not like that resurrection weed where it will reroot. These ones don't reroot. So once they're pulled, you don't have to worry about it. If they do have the seed heads already formed on them, but they're not open, you want to take those out of the garden, because they can continue as the plant dries out. Those seed pods will open and release all of those seeds. So you want to make sure you don't leave that. These don't do really well with competition. So, you know, if you're going to mulch it, or if you're going to, you know, have a nice plant stand around it, they usually won't germinate, won't do very well with competition. So you won't see this one in your turf very often. But pre-emergence can also work because we're dealing with that seed set. Post-emergence will work, so you could spray this when it's really small. You could spray it in spring, or you could wait until the fall to spray it. I really wouldn't wait until the fall, really, because you're going to have a seed bank that starts to get established. All right, the nightshades. There's a couple of nightshades that I see in Utah quite often. There's a perennial nightshade that has a purple flower on it, and all of the flowers in the nightshades kind of look like a star. They're related to tomatoes and peppers, so they're in that same family. Some of these can be really poisonous. Now this one's hairy nightshade, this one's an annual. The purple one is your perennial, and the purple one is a lot more deadly than what you would find with the hairy nightshade. So if you're seeing the one that's purple, you want to remove that one from your landscape, because if you have pets or kids, that can cause some serious problems. I have fantastic neighbors. They're just to the back of me, but they have an area that has scrub oak, like gamble oak, and then they have vinca all in underneath it. And the perennial one, the more deadly, the deadly nightshade, comes up in all of that area, and it actually pokes its way through my fence. I have a nice wood slat fence, and it somehow manages to find a way just to get through those slats. And I've had to go around the property line and help remove those, because they do have little kids and, you know, things, pets and things that would be adversely affected by that. So just be aware that some of the nightshades can be really poisonous. This one, the white one, like I said, is an annual, so it's going to set seed every year. You can see the leaves kind of have this little ruffled edge, so that kind of gives it away when it's early on in its growth cycle. It will produce these little berries that kind of look like baby tomatoes, and that's what kind of makes it appealing to kids to eat. These will turn red, and it looks like a nice little baby tomato. And so making sure that these aren't anywhere around kids is important. So pre-emergence, hand pulling, post-emergence, all work on these plants. So those are some of the more common ones that you're going to run across in your landscapes. I kind of wanted to touch on some of the more noxious weeds that you may also deal with. So an invasive weed, by definition, is an aggressive plant that spreads into sites and takes over, displacing other plants. So we talk a lot about invasive. What is invasive? And that just means it's aggressive. So we talk a lot about Dyers. We talk a lot about Dyers woad that's up in our mountain, and it's that yellow kind of big flower that shows up around this time of year. You can see it out blooming now. It's always on the foothills, and that is an invasive weed. It comes into an area or a landscape, and it outcompetes, and it moves through the area very quickly and takes over that site. It's a little bit different than what a noxious weed is. Oh, I love this. This is my favorite weed cartoon, and I feel like this sometimes when I go out into my yard. We never should have waited this long. Now the weeds have completely taken over. Do you ever feel like you're held hostage? I do sometimes. So these are the noxious weeds. Noxious weeds, by definition, have to be controlled. We have state laws that say you must control these. You may be very familiar with this one up here in the top left corner. We're going to talk a little bit about that weed. So a noxious weed, by definition, is a plant designated by law as an undesirable plant and requiring control. So if you have a noxious weed in your yard, you are required by law to take care of it. So here's the noxious weed list for the state of Utah. Now, counties have lists also, and the counties can add things to the list, but they can't take things away. So all of these plants on this list, wherever you are, you cannot have them. So, but if you live in Davis County or you live in Weber County, there may be a few more that are added onto the list. So Bermuda grass is one that I get a lot of questions about. Field bindweed, we also call morning glory. That is the devil. A lot of these you're going to see in your landscape. So Bermuda grass, field bindweed, hoary cress, Johnson grass can come up. These ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that we tend to see in landscapes more often. The loosestrifes, the pepperweed, quackgrass. I know a lot of people get quackgrass in their landscape. Starthistle has become, this yellow starthistle has become a big problem in Davis County. So that's one that we should be definitely aware of. Canada thistle, Scotch thistle, Dyers woad, all of these plants are on that noxious weed list. So let's take a minute and go through some of the ones that are landscape concerns, because these are ones you're going to, these are ones you're going to run into. So this is Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is a warm season grass. So you have probably Kentucky bluegrass out in your yard right now. Kentucky bluegrass is a little bit different than this type of grass. Kentucky bluegrass is a cool season grass. So what happens is it wakes up really nice and early in the spring. It has a lot of good growth in the spring, and then we kind of have a dip in the summertime. It kind of slows down in the heat of the summer, gets a little brown, and that's totally normal. And then when fall comes and our temperatures drop, we get that nice lush growth again. We get beautiful green grass again. Bermuda grass and warm season grasses act exactly opposite. So instead of having that nice growth in the spring, they're really slow to wake up. So you'll have patches in your lawn that stay brown, just really brown. And then as soon as the heat is on, like right now, you'll see that grass turn green and put on a ton of growth. And then when fall comes, we will see that dip again in growth. So it doesn't like to grow when it's cool. Instead, it puts on the growth when it's really, really warm. It is extremely invasive and very difficult to get rid of. How I ID it is if you will look at the grass blades, it has these leaves that come off in a ladder. So they're kind of opposite, or they're alternate. So they're, as you go up that main stem, they're alternating. So it's like you were walking up a ladder. They're never straight across from each other. You'll also see these finger-like seed heads, which is what we have on crabgrass. So you kind of have to look at the seed head, and then you have to look at the leaf structure. And why this is such a terrible weed, a noxious weed, is because of how it spreads. So this one spreads by stolons. So what a stolon is it's a specialized stem that goes above the ground. So if you have strawberries and you've watched a strawberry send out a runner, that's a stolon. It goes above the ground, and then it will create some new roots, and it will form a new plant at some point in time. So it spreads just like a strawberry, but it's very, very aggressive. And it also spreads by seed. So we've got two ways of seed dispersal here, or of plant dispersal, I should say. Two ways for it to create new plants and create a larger stand. This can be so hard to get rid of. A lot of the times it's not responsive to some of our normal chemicals that we kind of rely on heavily, like, you know, this is a grass weed. I can't use 2,4-D on it because it's not a broadleaf weed. So I'm stuck with things like Roundup. I also have some specialized chemicals that work really well on it. So triclopyr and glufosinate are both registered for Bermuda grass. Now, if you're going to chemically attack the Bermuda grass and you're going to tell it to take a hike, you're going to have to do it over and over and over again. I get people that come into the office and they bring me a sample of this, and I say, yes, you have Bermuda grass, and I give them a whole bunch of information on how to treat it, send them on their way, and then I get a call a month later, and they say, oh, well, I applied the chemical, but it's still here. You have to do it over and over and over again. It takes multiple applications, and you have to stay on top of it. So if this is in your lawn, you're going to look at something like the triclopyr or glufosinate, and that will help you. If you used the glyphosate product, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, if you were to use that product, it would also kill out your Kentucky bluegrass that this is in. So the other two don't necessarily do that. But, you know, if you're really serious about getting rid of it, you know, that may be what you have to do. Just remember that it does take those multiple applications. Johnson grass is another grass. So again, I'm stuck with no broadleaf weed control. So it's very difficult sometimes to control these grasses, especially when they're in our grass, because with our chemical options, they're so limited. So this was actually brought into the United States as a feed for animals, and it was brought into Mississippi, and there was a plantation owner who had a river bottom farm, and his last name was Johnson, and he was cultivating this grass as feed for his cattle and for his horses. And he's on a river bottom, and things like to spread through water, so of course this spread like crazy. And you can see this plant, it's very tall, but you can see how it comes up, and then look at these, again, we've got these stolons that will go above ground, or actually these are rhizomes, they go below ground. So those rhizomes will shoot below ground, and they'll go and they'll run, and then they'll pop up and create another plant. So all of these plants are interconnected with all of these rhizomes going under the ground. It's just like the strawberry again, but these ones now are underground. So how we can kind of take care of this, if this is a problem for you, if you have a large area that you're trying to keep pasture in, intensive grazing will help this. Roundup or glyphosate is kind of your one and only choice when taking care of this, or hand pulling. If you see this come up when it's very small, it kind of has this red tinge to the leaf, it has a nice wide blade, and we can help you ID this, but we're probably going to tell you Roundup or glyphosate is where you're going to be for chemical control on this type of plant. Quackgrass, this is one that I get in the office often. This is a very tough plant to control. You can see it comes up, it has these nice wide blades. Those wide blades kind of give it away in your turf. So you'll see these wide blades coming and be like, what is that? That is not my normal Kentucky bluegrass. It reproduces again by seed and by rhizome spread. So you can see again, we've got two forms of dispersal. The seed heads look like this. They're kind of pokey. And they kind of almost have that wheat look where you've got these seed heads coming up kind of alternate along the stem. And then we've got these rhizomes that are running underground, and you can see how as they run, then they poke up a new plant every so often. So this is what makes it so hard to control, because if I get this plant, but some of the rhizome is left under the ground, I'm going to get more plants. So this is where it becomes really tough. One of the things about quackgrass is it has this ability to be what we call allelopathic, and that is where it won't let anything else grow around it. So there are a couple of plants that do this. Walnuts, black walnuts are one of them. They create a chemical that makes it so it's difficult for anything to grow around the base of them. And you can see here, the quackgrass is doing the same thing. I don't have anything else really growing around here, just the quackgrass. So it creates this chemical, it releases it into the soil, and it keeps the competition down. So it's basically learned how to eliminate its competitors so that it can create a really nice stand for itself. Again, with quackgrass, we're looking at, because it is a grass, we're stuck on that glyphosate or that Roundup to help control this type of weed. Okay, here we go. This is the devil right in itself. You didn't think you were going to look at a picture of the devil, but here it is. This is field bindweed. Field bindweed, we also call morning glory, and it is literally the worst. So it has these trumpet-like flowers. So you'll see these trumpet-shaped flowers. They can be pink, they can be purple, they can be white. So there's a little bit of variation in the color. You'll see the seedlings start to come up early in the spring. And once they're kind of established, they're very, very difficult to get away to get under control. So you can see after the flower forms, we get this little pod that breaks open, and we have a number of seeds spill out. Now this one is, like I told you, it's literally the worst. This one, the seeds are viable in the soil for 50+ years. So if you have had a problem with field bindweed, you're going to continue to have a problem with field bindweed. This one, you have to stay on top of. If I allow it to flower, if I allow it to go to seed, I'm just creating a bigger problem. So this is one where I'm going to schedule myself to go out into the yard. I'm going to weed. I'm going to take care of this every single week. And that's what I do at my house. I actually schedule a time to go out into my garden, because if I don't schedule it, I'm too busy and I won't do it. So I actually schedule a time to go out in my garden and weed. And along the fence line where my yard got nuked by those friendly people that came and sprayed, there's field bindweed that comes over from that lot. And so I spend a lot of time weeding up and down the edge of that fence line. This one has this ability to wrap around things. That's one of the things that gives it away. It creates this kind of windy, viney type plant that will wind up. If you have a chain link fence, it will go up the chain link fence. I lived in Kaysville for a while, and we had a neighbor next to us that had a chain link fence. And it was a rental property, and they didn't take care of anything. And so being the nice neighbor that I was, I actually would go over and I would try and control it, but under my breath I was saying a whole lot of bad words because they wouldn't control it, and it's on the noxious weed list, and it made me crazy. So you never get away from it. It's one that's always there. Now with control on this one, it can be really, really difficult. And this is one, just like the Bermuda grass, just like quackgrass, you have to stay on top of it. So it's going to take multiple applications, and it takes a long time to get this kind of under control. So what I tell people to do is to wait to control this with chemicals until the fall. In the spring and in the summer, you're probably going to be hand pulling or using hand cultivation. I use that scuffle hoe or that hula hoe, and I just scrape the top of the soil and I knock the plant off. This one, the roots can extend down into the soil 30 feet, and the roots are, they're viable. So if I was to take a tiller and till through a stand of field bindweed, every little piece of root has the ability to form a new plant. So I don't want to till. So I just want to scuff the top of the surface, because if the plant can't come up and if it can't photosynthesize, then it can't put more nutrition down into the roots. And I eventually, if I keep doing this, I'm going to help weaken the plant. Now in the fall, you can take a combination of your broadleaf weed killer, which is 2,4-D, and Roundup or glyphosate, and you can go out after the first freeze. So this creates on the leaves, it has a really nice waxy surface. If you'll wait until the first freeze, that freeze actually breaks apart that waxy surface just a little bit. And then you go out and you spray, and it helps the chemical penetrate into the leaf a little bit better. Plus in the fall time, perennial plants will take energy from the leaves and from the top part of the plant, and it will pull all the energy, all the nutrition, everything that it has down into the roots. And it does that so that next year in the spring, it can use that energy, it can use that nutrition, and it can push all of that new growth out into this in the spring. So the plant is actively taking things down into the roots. So if I put a chemical control on the leaves when it's pulling things down into the roots, I'm going to be able to move that chemical into the roots and really help to make a dent in my field bindweed in my yard. Hoary cress is another one that people have a really hard time controlling. Again, multiple ways of making new plants. So this one creates seeds from the top. You can see that why it's called white top. It has this nice white flowery top up on the top of the plant. And this one will flower in the early summer, late spring. So right around now, I've seen quite a few stands of this blooming through Davis County lately. We're very good at growing it. So it will bloom and it will create all these seeds, but underneath the soil, it has this very extensive root system. And that extensive root system helps, it's just like bindweed, helps to put up all of these plants all in a great big stand. So you usually don't find one plant of hoary cress, you usually find a huge stand of it. And that's because of that extensive root system and the amazing ability that it has to disperse those seeds. It's in the mustard family, so that tells me it's going to flower a little bit earlier. It's going to have an earlier emergence from the soil than a lot of our other weeds. Mustards are what we call our winter weeds. So if you have weeds that are coming up really early in the spring and germinating really early, it's probably in that mustard family. And so you'll see these plants emerge early spring. So this is one where, again, we're going to have to stay on top of the control. We're going to have to work really hard on this one. So we don't want this plant to go to seed. So we're going to mow it. We're going to cut it so that it doesn't create those flowers. And then we're going to hit it with a chemical control, and we're going to do it in this early spring. If it's already up, we can do it in the early spring. And we can also do it in the fall. And I would very much recommend that you do it in the fall, because it's just like that field bindweed, where it's going to take that nutrition, take that energy, and put it down into the root zone of that plant. Perennial pepperweed is probably one that not all of you are going to deal with, but it's common enough that you'll see it. One of the things about perennial pepperweed, it's tall. You can see how tall it is in this photo, and it has these really pretty little white flowers up on the top of it. But how it disperses its seeds is really kind of interesting. It's in the mustard family again, so it's one of those early emergers early in the spring. And it creates the seed pod, which is called, in the mustard family, they create a specific seed pod called a silique. And that silique has 2 chambers in it. And this specific plant in those 2 chambers has 1 seed on each side. Some of them have multiple seeds on each side, but this one only has 1 on each side. So that's one of the giveaways on this plant. The other thing is that the plant will actually bend over when it's ready to disperse its seeds. The top just flops over and it shakes the seeds down and the seeds drop to the ground. So that's one way that it helps itself to reproduce. Again, this one, same type of controls. You can come through, you can mow it, you can cut the top off with a shovel, or you can use a scuffle hoe. We just don't want it to go to seed. And then again, this one has a pretty tough root system to deal with. So we will spray again in the fall, see if we can get some of that chemical down into that root system. Yellow star thistle, like I said when we started this one has become a big problem in Davis County. So if you are over by Walmart, where these big soccer fields are, kind of just to the west of Walmart, there has been a big pile of dirt that was brought in to the city, and it had yellow star thistle weeds in it. And so the city has used that soil to move around the city and fill in spots and do things, not knowing that it was full of star thistle seeds. So they found out when everything started to germinate, and they traced all of that soil back to that soil pile. And now we're working on dealing with yellow star thistle. So this one can be kind of tough. The roots on this one can extend 3 feet into the soil, and this is typical of our thistles. They have very, very extensive root systems. So it will also send out rhizomes, so those runners under the ground to create new plants, and it will also spread by seed. So you can see that it's got multiple ways of dispersal again. One of the things about it that makes it so bad, I mean, it's kind of pretty. It's yellow, it's kind of airy looking. It's just, you know, kind of a pretty plant, but we don't want it because it steals water and it steals nutrients from our native plant stands, and it will outcompete our native plants for those resources. Also with horses, this one can cause what's called chewing disease. It can actually kill your horses. So if this comes up in your pastures or anywhere where horses are, you need to take care of it immediately. It can kill your horses quickly. There are some biological control agents. So we've talked a lot about chemical control, and we've talked about mechanical controls, and we're going to go into this in a little bit. We're almost there to it. But there's also other insects that can come in and they can attack that specific plant. So there are insects that are very specific to this plant. And I know that Davis County and Layton City have worked very closely with UDAF to bring in some of those insects that are very specific to eating this plant and knocking back these stands of these thistles. This one is Canada thistle, and it's very, very similar to the star thistle, except for, you know, the color of the bloom. It's a little bit different on the color of the bloom. This one we get at the Botanical Center, and we get it pretty extensively. So how I was taught to take care of it is that you take a shovel or a scuffle hoe, and you just barely scuff the surface, and you cut back that plant. Again, we're trying to keep the plant from photosynthesizing. We don't want the plant to be able to build strength in the roots. And then again in the fall, we're going to hit it with a chemical control, 2,4-D and glyphosate, which is our Roundup, mixed together, and we're going to use that on that specific weed, and that will help. This is a very difficult plant to kill. It actually survived the eruption and landslide at Mount St. Helens, and it was the first plant to come back up after that giant eruption. So this one will spread quickly by rhizomes. You can see those rhizomes in this photo underground. It will also spread by seed dispersal. So not letting it go to seed is really, really important. Scotch thistle, this is what's in the vacant lot next to me that I really wanted them to control. because this is something that can become very difficult to control. So we had our weed specialist went down to southern Utah and to visit a farm down there. Somebody had purchased a lot of acreage. They were trying to create a farm, and they said that he could take this picture as long as he never said what farm it was, because they had this stand of Scotch thistle that was so embarrassing to them, because they were farmers, they were growers. How could they have Scotch thistle like this? And it's just one of those things that it was there on the land, and it moved through with these underground rhizomes again and created this basically forest of thistles. And you can see, I mean, they're easily 12 feet tall. You'll see in the first year, so thistles are biennial weeds. We kind of talked about that at the beginning. They will form a rosette of leaves, just like what you see in this middle picture in the first year. So star thistle will do this, and Canada thistle will do this, Scotch thistle, bull thistles, they'll all do this. So they'll have this rosette that forms in the center, and then the second year, it will put up a stalk. And that's where we have that seed dispersal. So if you have thistles that come up in your lawn, I know that happens sometimes, especially if you have neighbors around you or empty lots where the thistle seeds blow in. Mowing is a really good form of control, because you're not going to let this go to seed. And if it doesn't go to seed, this only lives 2 years. So if it doesn't ever go to seed, it will be there the first year, it will be the second year, and you just keep mowing it, and eventually it will go away. Russian knapweed looks a lot like some of the thistles, but it doesn't have that kind of pokey bottom. If you look at the thistles, they all have this kind of pokey area on the flower, where this one doesn't. This one's much softer, but this one can be very difficult to control again. It will reproduce from seed and also from vegetative root buds. So just like what we've been talking about with morning glory, or field bindweed is what we call it. Those buds on the roots can create new plants. So you don't want to till through a stand of this Russian knapweed. The best control for this is mowing. So repeated mowing. So if this is coming up in some of your turf or in some of your areas like pastures, you want to mow it. And then those herbicide applications. So this is a broadleaf weed, so I can use that broadleaf weed killer in the spring and in the fall to help take care of it. All right, we're almost done with this, and we're going to move to IPM. This is purple loosestrife. This shows up around our waterways. It is so pretty, but it is so invasive, and we don't want to keep this in our waterways. It spreads with rhizomes again, so those underground runners. The leaves, you can see, are kind of this lance shape, and it can be very, very invasive in our waterways. It actually takes up a lot of water and reduces our water resources as they run through some of our rivers. So we don't want to keep this. So if you have this in a wet area of your yard, you want to get rid of it, because it will use up the water very quickly. And this is that Dyers woad that I was telling you about, that yellow that we get up in the foothills of the mountains. I've actually had people tell me, it's so pretty, where do I get it? Can I transplant it into my yard? No, you can't. It's a bad, bad weed. So it was actually brought into the valley when the pioneers moved in. They would use the seeds. You can see the seeds here in this middle picture. They would use it as a dye, and it actually creates a blue dye, and they would use that for their clothing. But like all plants, they eventually escaped and moved through. It has moved through the valley pretty extensively. So it is, again, in the mustard family. These are those siliques that I was telling you about, those seed pods. You can kind of see there's 2 chambers, one on each side, and then it will have multiple seeds inside of it. If you're up walking in the foothills, pulling these while you're walking is a fantastic thing to do if you're up for a hike or whatever you're doing. Just know that if they have the seed pods on them, and you pull it out and you don't bag it and take it out, that those seeds are still viable, and they will still continue, even if they're green, like what you see here, they'll still continue to ripen on the plant until they are ready to fall off the plant. So you kind of have to bag these when they get to that phase. But this is that umbel-shaped flower. They can resprout from the roots. So if you pull it and you don't get all the roots, they'll resprout from the roots. They're really kind of tricky. Okay, so how do we control all of this? We've talked all about all of these terrible things. One of the things that we should really talk about is what's called integrated pest management. And I know it says pest, but weeds are also pests in our landscape. IPM is a philosophy of control that we use that's founded on ecological principles. We're basically looking at the whole picture of our yard, of our garden, and we're trying to avoid some of the crop loss problems or the weed stand problems that we get, but minimize how much chemical we put into the environment, any kind of harmful thing that we're going to put in the environment. We kind of want to minimize that and take care of it. So IPM is a little bit more tolerant approach to weed control than some of our traditional programs. So instead of just going out and spraying all the time, I'm actually going to use some different things. I'm going to be well educated. I'm going to keep things clean. I'm going to do some of these maintenance and cultural practices. This is where I go out and I actually hand weed and I help myself so that I don't have to apply so many herbicides or pesticides to my area. And it involves all of these tactics in order to create a really nice way to control our weeds so that we're not just out there willy-nilly spraying. So the history of IPM, if you don't know a lot about some of these synthetic pesticides and herbicides that we have that help control our weeds and our insects, we didn't have these until around World War II. We created some of these chemicals for warfare, and we found out that they also kill plants. So we took that and we did a lot of research on it, and in 1936 we had about 30 registered pesticides and herbicides that we could use on our farms and in our gardens. But by 1972 we had done a lot of research, we had played with a lot of chemicals, we had over 900 registered pesticides and herbicides. So just in the space of almost 40 years, we had a massive increase in the amount of chemical that we were putting out into the environment. The chemicals we found were really effective. They killed things great, like put it out there in your garden, the weeds are gone the next day, the insects are gone. They were really easy to use. It's a lot easier to go out and spray a chemical than it is to go and hand weed. And that's when I tell people, you know, you're going to have to hand weed this if you don't want to use the chemical, and they get kind of upset, but that's just how it is. If you're not going to use the chemicals, it's a little bit harder work. And we found out that it was relatively inexpensive to use some of these chemicals. So we developed some of these chemicals, some that are broad spectrum. So they're not selective. So that's like with Roundup. Roundup is what is a non-selective herbicide. It kills everything it touches, where a broadleaf weed control like 2,4-D is selective. It's only going to kill the broadleaf weeds. We've learned about the genetics, and we've learned about the metabolism of these plants, and we're able to create things that are selective that work just on one type of plant instead of everything. So sprays were really broad spectrum, non-selective. They were being used all the time. Whether they were needed or not, we were spraying everything. And we found out that when we sprayed everything, we created resistance. And sometimes this happens with our weeds too, where our insects or our plants that we're dealing with begin to develop resistance to the chemicals that we're using. And that's because we're using so many chemicals. So resistance is a significant decrease in the sensitivity to a chemical. So that just means that if I go out and I spray Roundup on that plant, if I spray it and the plant lives, it can create this resistance. It's no longer sensitive to that chemical. And if it reproduces, then I can have a whole stand of plants that can't respond to that chemical. So this is kind of how I think about it. If you have a population that's made up of individuals, they vary in genetic makeup. So just like these dogs, we have a bunch of dogs, but they are all very different genetically. Resistance is the ability of one of these types of dogs in our population to survive a chemical exposure. So if I was to expose all these dogs to something, all of them would be susceptible to that chemical except for the Labrador. The Labrador would live, and he or she would be very happy, and that Labrador would reproduce and have puppies. The puppies are going to be resistant. Some of the puppies, not all of them, but some of them will be resistant. And next time I spray that chemical, I will have Labrador dogs that are no longer susceptible to that chemical. So my chemical is no longer effective. I have Labradors everywhere, which is not a bad thing in this example, but if we're talking about field bindweed becoming resistant to glyphosate or 2,4-D, that can be a real problem. So resistance is the natural ability of a variation of an organism to survive exposure to that herbicide that would normally kill that individual of that species. So we don't want to develop resistance in our plants. And this can occur with many things. It occurs with insects, it can occur with weeds, it can occur with fungus. It can occur when we take too many antibiotics, when we use antibiotics on the same disease on humans over and over and over again. We can develop resistance, and we get resistant strains of some of these organisms that can be really dangerous because then we can't control it. So resistant weeds can survive repeated exposures to chemical, and then they reproduce and they create this resistant variation. But if resistance is managed from the beginning using IPM, so I'm not just out there willy-nilly spraying, I'm kind of thinking about it before I spray, then my chemicals can remain effective and useful. So when we rely only on chemical control, that's what we call conventional management. And we just look at a calendar and we say it's time to spray. We don't think about it. We don't think about if it's needed. We don't have a threshold where we say, okay, now we have enough weeds that maybe we need to go spray. And we don't really think about the chemicals that we're using. And we're kind of missing that system-wide perspective. So when we use IPM, the first thing that we kind of need to think about is what tools can we use? And the first one is knowledge. So we need to know a little bit about the weed that we're talking about, that we're trying to control, which is just what we did. We talked about these weeds. You know a little bit about the biology, how it spreads. Does it spread only by seed? Does it spread by, you know, underground runners like rhizomes? Does it spread through the wind? How does it spread? We know how it spreads and how it reproduces. Where is it usually found? Is it on a disturbed site? So things like Canada thistle show up on disturbed sites where dandelions show up in our lawn. So understanding that can kind of change how I react to that weed. And let's see, we're not going to talk about host plants because that's just insects. With that knowledge, so here we have, this is Canada thistle. We know it's a perennial weed with really deep roots. It can have male and female parts, so not all of Canada thistle, if you do a little bit of research, you'll find out that not all of it reproduces by seed, but some of it does. It will reproduce by seeds and rhizomes, and it's found in deep moist soils in the Great Basin, usually on disturbed sites. And I know, because we talked about that extensive root system, that we don't want to till this because we're going to get more Canada thistle coming up if I till this. We're going to do an application of herbicides in the fall. We're going to cut the plant down at the crown using that scuffle hoe or using a shovel. And we have so much knowledge now that I can effectively deal with this plant without just going out and willy-nilly spraying it. Because if I spray it at the wrong time, if I spray it in the spring, it may not be as effective as if I spray it in the fall. And I know that that plant is taking down all of that chemical into the roots and will help me kill the plant. Monitoring is another really good part of IPM. So this is where we go outside and we look and we see what weeds we have and we see how many of them we have. This is going to tell me, hey, you've got some potential problems here. You have thistles popping up in your lawn. Where are they coming from? Maybe I need to go and find the source. It will also determine that life cycle stage of my insects and plants. So this is where I look at the plant and I figure out, is it an annual, is it a biennial, is it a perennial? And I can kind of monitor that. And I know, like with my thistles, that it's a biennial. So I know that if I mow it and I keep on top of the mowing and I don't let it flower, that it will be gone in 2 years. And this kind of helps you determine if you should treat and what management strategies you should use and if they are working. Methods of cultural control, methods of control include cultural, mechanical, biological, physical, chemical. So our cultural controls is this is where we make the environment less favorable for that weed. So this is where we take and we increase the health of our turf stand. I'm going to make sure that I work really hard on making my turf healthy and thick and lush so that I don't have the weed germination that I could have if my turf was not as healthy. Sanitation kind of falls into this, so making sure I clean up that Purslane, the resurrection weed, making sure I clean it up after I weed it so that it doesn't reroot into the soil. Crop rotation can help with this. A lot of the times if you have weeds in your garden, you'll notice that the same weeds come up with the same types of plants. So crop rotation can help because we sometimes manage plants a little bit differently. Cover crops are a great way to help control weeds in the garden because it gives you this nice thick stand when you're not using the garden space. So you would plant those in the fall, and that will help to keep the weeds down early in the spring and just keeping that high density plant stand. We talked a little bit about solarization. That's where we have that clear plastic that we put out over the garden. We heat the soil and we kill the weed seeds, and that is a fantastic thing to do. It allows the sun to penetrate and heat up the soil underneath that plastic, but it doesn't let the infrared radiation come out of the plastic. So that traps that radiation and it keeps it really warm under there, and that is going to kill our weeds. Mechanical control, this is where we're going to directly remove those weeds. This works really well if you have a small garden and you can walk through. It's just like what I do where I schedule my once a week walk through the garden and remove what I need to remove. And you can see this guy here, he's removing Dyers woad. He's a good guy. So cultivation, hand pulling some of those different types of weeds that we can hand pull that will really help to keep those plant stands down. Biological control is not as common. So this is where we have a predator, an insect usually, that will seek out and eat an undesirable plant. We also have some fungus controls or virus controls that we can sometimes use, but these are a little more few and far between. One really good example of this is the cactus moth larva. So in Australia in the 1920s, they had an infestation of prickly pear, and it moved across Australia, and there was just prickly pear everywhere. And they raise a lot of sheep. They do a lot of cattle in Australia, and so the prickly pear was very detrimental to the grazing areas. They found a moth in Argentina that would eat the prickly pear, and it was very specific. It only wanted to eat prickly pear. So they built up a population of these moth larvae, which you can see in this photo, and they sent them to Australia. And within 10 years, this cactus moth had completely decimated the prickly pear population. But the cost of developing something like this is extremely high, and it takes a number of years to make sure that larva, that prickly or that cactus moth larva, is not going to move to another plant that we want to keep. So there is a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of development, a lot of testing before they can release something like that out into the environment, but they do exist. There is a bindweed mite that the Colorado State University is working on. And you can actually pick it up in Colorado. So like I said, bindweed is the one that's like the common denominator with all of us. We all have bindweed in some way, shape, or form. But you can pick it up in Colorado at certain sites. What it does is this little, you can see these little white insects on the backside of the leaves. These are the mites. Mites are actually an arachnid, so it's not even an insect, but it's more closely related to a spider. But they feed on the leaves, and they make the leaves really thick, and they form these kind of galls, which look like kind of tumors all over the plant. And the plant can't stay healthy. It can't photosynthesize. It can't grow. It can't do what it wants to do. And so the plant eventually dies. These are not available in Utah yet, but I'm very hopeful that they will be very soon. Physical control methods, this is where we're going to physically keep those weeds from getting in. So barriers, fences can sometimes help. Screens can sometimes help. Covering areas like what you see here. If you didn't want the weeds to get in, or you're having a huge problem with weeds blowing in, so like I get elm seeds that blow into my garden, I could do this and it would reduce the area where the elm seeds were. And then we have our chemical control, and chemical controls to me are really a last resort. I do everything else I can first. I will maintain my turf. I will, put mulches down in my garden. I will go out, I will hand weed. And then if I can't control it, if I have nowhere else to turn and I need some help, then I use the chemical controls. A lot of my work is focused on edible crops, and maybe that's where I get that kind of mentality, because I don't want to be putting a lot of chemicals on my edible crops, but I also don't want a lot of chemicals on my lawn where my kids are, where my dogs are, so it should always kind of be our last resort. Record keeping of what you spray is really important. We learned this when my yard got nuked, that making sure that there were records, that we could go back to the company, we could find out what they sprayed. So you should always be keeping a journal of what you spray and what you applied. And this is kind of what will happen, you know, this is kind of what happened to my yard. Some of these chemicals will drift or do what we call volatilize, and that is where at high temperatures, so you need to read the label, you need to know the temperature recommendations on that label of the product that you're using. I cannot stress that enough for you to read the label before you apply. So look for a temperature restriction. If you're above 85, a lot of the chemicals cannot be used. Even Roundup shouldn't be used above about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So, but with 2,4-D and a lot of our broadleaf chemicals, 85 is kind of that max. I tell people 80, and that's what I wrote on the slide, because a lot of the times, you know, our weather station is a few miles away, or it feels like it's about 80 degrees or 85 degrees, but sometimes our temperature will spike just a little bit through the day, and sometimes it gets a little hotter than what, you know, is what they're saying on the news, what's going to happen. Sometimes we're a few degrees above. So I tell people 80 is a really safe spot to be. Certain plants are much more susceptible to herbicide drift. This is a grape, and if you even whisper 2,4-D around a grapevine, it will do this. So this is what we call epinasty, and a lot of these chemicals that you use on your weeds are growth regulators. And so this is changing the growth rate of every part of the plant that it touches. That chemical will change the growth rate, and that plant will grow in a funky way. It basically speeds up the metabolism so fast that the plant can't continue to sustain that, and the plant will outgrow itself and it will die. That's kind of how they work. So if you see damage like this, if you see curled, drooping leaves, you know that you've probably sprayed when it was either too windy or when the temperatures were too high. So just be very, very careful with spraying. I cannot stress that enough. And we've had so many people come in this year with herbicide damage or sending me pictures, and just because it's been a very windy kind of late spring, and people are eager to get this chemical control down, but they're not reading the labels and they're not watching what they're doing. And so this can be very detrimental to landscapes. People always say, you know, some of this stuff is so toxic. Yes, it is. Just a little word about the toxicity. There's a thing called the LD50, and that's where if you were to give a population a dose of this, 50% of the population would die. So you can see this kind of lays it out for you as to which ones are most toxic. And the higher the number, the less toxic it is. So the lower the number, so paraquat is 157. You don't need very much paraquat, and this is a measurement in ounces or something, I can't remember. But that paraquat, you don't need very much of it to kill 50% of the population, where tordon, you're gonna need a whole lot of it to kill the population. So you can kind of see that, you know, these are a little bit less on the toxic scale. These are a little bit more on the toxic scale. I've heard of a professor that used to drink Roundup in a class to prove that it wasn't toxic, and that just sounds horrible to me. I would never do that. But it's a little bit less toxic than some of these others. Another word about chemical control: if you are going to use a chemical, please follow the personal protective equipment recommendations on the label. I see far too many people out spraying in flip-flops and shorts with no gloves on, and they're not covered up. And anytime these chemicals touch your skin, it's an exposure. You're getting a dose of this. So making sure that you're wearing closed-toed shoes, you're wearing Levi's, you wear like a nitrile glove when you're mixing. When you're mixing is the highest, it was when you have the highest probability of exposure. So always wear gloves when you're mixing, and just really cover yourself up and protect yourself. So here's again on the toxicity, the amount that would kill an average 150-pound human. So again, those same chemicals are here. So paraquat, like I said, you don't need very much. 2,4-D is a little more toxic. Our Roundup, you'd need a couple pints. The tordon, you'd need 5 pints. So just be very careful. Follow all the precautions. Wear your personal protective equipment and use those IPM principles. So start with the least toxic options and move your way up as needed is is kind of my recommendation that I give to people. And it's what I do personally. I really start less toxic and move my way up. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them, Dave. Thank you guys for being here and learning about weeds with me.
So yeah, there are a few questions
Okay.
that I'll let you kind of just address verbally with the group. So well, while we were talking about the IPMs, one question came up about weeding, like flame weeding, just burning the weed.
Yeah. So be very careful with it. So if you're like me and you're a little bit klutzy, it's probably not the method for you. I almost lit my neighbor's house on fire with one of those, but it does work very well. It works well on very small weeds and it works on annual weeds. So what it does is it burns back the top of the weed, but if you're dealing with a perennial weed like bindweed, it's never going to kill the bindweed, or even dandelions. Anything that's perennial is going to continue to come up from the roots. So yeah, it will take the top off. It works really well for that, but for those perennial weeds, not the best option.
Okay. So another couple of questions about, well, there was a question about pasture grass and
Right.
how you might get pasture grass out of your lawn.
So really your options are to cut it out, to burn it out, to use Roundup, which is a non-selective herbicide, and that's going to kill the patch where your lawn is, and you're going to have to reseed or put down a new piece of sod. That's really the only way that you can control that.
Okay. I don't recall if you talked about foxtail and how to remove it.
I didn't. Again, foxtail is another grass. It's a very common grass. So if it's in your lawn, you're going to have to use a non-selective herbicide, again, like Roundup. If it's in your garden, it's really easy to pull. So I would just hand pull it if it's not in your lawn or in a spot where it's hard to get to.
Okay. Question about aspen shoots, or maybe some other type of tree roots that are kind of aggressive that come up. Maybe address those.
Okay, so aspens are a fantastic tree and I love them, but I love them in the mountains and not in our landscape. And that is just for this very reason. They come up all through your grass, and as soon as you cut one down, you get a million shoots coming up. So understand that aspens are all connected underground. They're all one organism. So if I treat with chemical control the aspen shoots coming up, I'm giving the tree also a dose, the tree that is next to it that it is connected to. So it can be very difficult to control without killing your trees. So mowing is kind of one of your options unless you wanted to remove the trees. But the only safe and effective way to kind of keep those down is to mow without killing the trees.
Okay, great. Now I'll just, those of you that are typing in questions right now, I'm just going to ask those verbally to Sheridan and she can answer them. I've got one more that I had written down though, just from earlier in the presentation. If you're not interested in applying chemicals, if you've got bees, you actually have beehives and you don't want to do anything that might affect the bees, where can they go for some of the best organic options, or what, if you have any recommendations?
Okay, so I have bees. I'm a beekeeper. I actually run one of the beekeeping programs for USU. So as far as herbicides go, they're pretty non-toxic to bees. It's when we talk about insecticides that we run into problems with bees. Application in the evening is the best time with bees. So if you have to use something, apply it in the evening, because the bees, for the most part, have gone back to the hive. Allow it to dry. And then in the morning, the bees come out and they're really not affected by it. There is kind of a misconception with organic chemicals and them being less toxic to bees. Some of the organic chemicals are just as toxic, if not more so. So this is where that IPM principle comes in, where you want to start with every other kind of control and then move to chemicals. So I have a big garden here at the USU Botanical Center. We've been dealing with earwigs, which I know are not a weed, but it's the same principle. I'm to the point now where I can't continue to grow this and deal with it the way I have been. So today I made the decision that I have to use a chemical, I'm going to use it once. I'm going to spray it in the evening because I have hives right next to this area. Use it once, spray it in the evening, make sure it is dry by the morning. So I'm going to spray it on, you know, a day when I know that the temperature at night is going to be a little bit higher and when it's not windy. So you may have to use something, you know, just be very, very careful, but know that those organic options are not any more safe.
While you're on that topic, there was a question about just your organic herbicides using home products like vinegar, soap, those kind of things.
Okay, I get a lot of questions about this. So there's really not a lot of research about it, and that is because vinegar, some of these products are not labeled as an herbicide. So there's no label on them that tells you what the rate is. So people, when they mix it, and when they do this at home, they can mix at a much higher rate than what would be recommended if it was being used in that fashion. And so it can be very detrimental to your soils. It can be very detrimental to the surrounding plants and landscape and to some of the insects and things that it's going to come in contact with. I understand that it's a home product and people, you know, really do feel that it's safe. As far as chemicals go, the label is the law. So there is no label on that vinegar that says, hey, you can use this for herbicides. If you do use it, which I know it is effective for some people, if you do use it, it works well on annual weeds when they're just barely coming up. So if you have like that redroot pigweed and you were to go out and you were to spray it with that, you'd probably find it was really effective when you sprayed it when it was really small. For perennial weeds, it does not work because you're just going to barely burn the top back and that weed is going to come back with a vengeance. So it really doesn't work in those type situations.
Great, thanks. Let's go on to a few more that have just typed in.
Okay.
Did you talk about puncture vine or goat heads?
I did not. So that one is very easily controlled with a broadleaf weed killer. So if you have that coming up, you can use the 2,4-D when temperatures are below 85, and that will help to control it. It's one of those that you're going to have a seed bank again, so you're going to want to spray as you see them coming up year after year. Again, keeping your grass stand nice and healthy will really help if they're in your lawn areas.
Okay, and yeah, that's I think that's enough on that one. How did you get how do you get rid of crown vetch?
So crown vetch, I'm thinking they're talking about some of the, there's a couple of different vetches. So the vetch again is any kind of vetch, again is a broadleaf weed, so you can deal with that with another broadleaf weed killer. It can be a little bit tough to get rid of because they are pretty persistent, but you have to kind of stay on top of it. So just the broadleaf weed killer or hand pulling will work as well. Just stay on top of it.
Okay. Another one is, if I understand what you're saying, you should not be spraying Roundup if the temperature is above 80. Is that the high for the day or the temperature at the time of spraying?
That is the high for the day. So you can apply early in the morning with something like Roundup. Now 2,4-D is a little different. 2,4-D can volatilize 2 to 3 weeks after you spray it. So it can stay in the environment and it can come off the plant and form this kind of cloud that moves around the landscape, and it will move to the lowest spot and it will move all around and kill all kinds of things. So knowing that it could happen 2 weeks after you spray, you want to make sure you're spraying when it's really nice and cool for 2,4-D. Roundup, different story. And Roundup, we can go up to 90 degrees. So Roundup, you can spray 90 degrees and it doesn't volatilize like 2,4-D does typically.
Okay, yeah, that should probably cover that one. And if this question was yours out there, you can type a follow-up question if we need more information on it.
Okay.
The next question is, this person is, I have an Army Corps of Engineers wetlands next to me for the last 20 years. In the last 5 years, a Noxious, I think it's Johnson grass, super tall and feathery, has invaded and is taking over and killing all the natural good wetland grasses and animal habitat. What should I do?
So wetlands are a totally different ballgame. If you're in a wetland area, there are really strict regulations. And this is where if it's a noxious weed, you want to work with whichever county you're in to kind of help control it. So you can look up and find your county weed coordinator. There's one in every county, and have them come out and look at the weed, make sure it is what you think it is, and they can help with some of the recommended controls. But you'll have to call the county offices and find the county weed person in your area. Just wetlands are very, very sensitive, and there are only a couple of chemicals that are registered for those areas. So, and that gets a little bit complicated, a little out of my realm. I don't want to say something that's wrong, so I would recommend you find that county weed specialist.
And the last one that I have so far is, how do you recommend dealing with grass growing in your flower beds and in your ground covers?
Okay, so this is where we use a product. There's a product called Grass Out, I believe, or Grass Be Gone. And it's like a pre-emergent. You can put that down, and it doesn't affect the broadleaf plants, but it will help with the grass in those areas. I think it comes in a granular form, and you just spread it out. So that will really help you there.
Is that just for grasses that are not come up yet, or will that actually?
So you would put it, yeah, you would put it in the spring before things germinate. So if you have established grasses in those areas, you may have to do some hand pulling. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, so far, that is all the questions that have been typed in. I think you've addressed all of those.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Sheridan. We appreciate you being here. Oh, there's one more. Does Weed Master volatilize?
I believe it does. I would have to look it up and make sure that we're talking about the exact same product, but I believe it does. So just read the label. And if you can't read the label, if it's too small for you, you can type it up in your search bar online, and it will bring up a bigger label. You can just type in Weed Master and the exact product that you have. And then type up label, and it will bring it up so you can read it, but it will tell you on there, and it will have that temperature restriction, and that means it volatilizes. So just know that. Oh, Bermuda grass and flower beds I'm seeing pop up. So that's tricky. So again, you're going to be using Roundup or a non-selective herbicide or triclopyr or something like that. You're going to not want to hit the flowers. So you may have to do a lot of hand weeding, which again is kind of a downer, but that's just kind of how it is. A lot of hand weeding, and you can actually use on your, if you have like a little backpack sprayer, a little hand pump sprayer, you can get a cone that goes on the bottom of it that will help keep other things safe while you're spraying. And you just kind of put that down on the ground and try and stay away from some of those flowers.
Okay, well, thanks, Sheridan. I think that's it, and our time is up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This class has been recorded. We'll get it posted on our website. And in addition to the slides that have been shared from Sheridan. So if you want to go back and reference any of those slides, you're welcome to do that. And Sheridan, if they need to contact you at being involved with USU Extension, do you want to share your email?
Yeah, so it's Sheridan, which is SHERIDEN.Hansen, HANSEN @usu.edu. We also have a diagnostic lab, which you may find very helpful, and you can reach them at USU Davis Hotline @gmail.com. That's all one word, USU Davis Hotline @gmail.com. And they answer questions. I have a whole fleet of master gardeners that are amazing, and they will help answer questions once a week on Tuesdays. Right now is all we can do with all of the restrictions, but they'll help answer some of your questions. Sometimes they're a little more timely than I am. I'm out in the gardens a lot, and so sometimes they can help get back to you a little bit faster sometimes. So also reach out to them.
One more quick question just came in. I think they meant herbicides, but after applying herbicides, when can I plant?
So it depends on the herbicide. So with glyphosate, which is Roundup, I give it 7 days. With 2,4-D, remember it can stay active, and I said it could volatilize for 2 to 3 weeks. It can also be effective for 2 to 3 weeks. So you want to give that a good 3 weeks before you plant. So, okay.
That's it, Sheridan. Thanks
again.
All right.
Thanks so much, Dave.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.